Hunters, welcome back to another Flushing and Dustum episode. This episode again is brought to you by Hunt Ready, upland vest sourced here in the US of A, made for upland hunters to find their pursuits and always be hunt ready. It's also brought to you by Gundog Outdoors, specializing in safety gear for our working hunting dogs. Tonight, we have a special guest from Pheasants Forever, as well as the Sage Grouse Initiative. It is Michael Brown, and we're happy to have him on. We got to talking a little bit. He's a big baseball fan, obviously a big bird hunter. So we're excited to have you on, Michael. How about you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, like Kelly said, my name is Michael Brown. I work at Pheasants Forever. I'm Pheasants Forever's Sage Grouse Initiative Field Capacity Coordinator, which is a long name that I've got a staff of 16 biologists spread across the Western U.S. who are delivering conservation through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS, using those programs to get healthy rangelands on the landscape to support rural economies and the wildlife that depend on them.
Nice. So how long have you been with Pheasants Forever?
Yeah, so this is actually my 9th year starting. I started out in one of those field positions here in Washington State. I worked directly with ranchers, helped them install new fences, pipelines, and troughs, and did that for about 3.5 years. And then was promoted into this role. And so now I've been here almost 6.5 years and continue to enjoy every moment of it. The staff that we have on the field are what's key, but it's fun to make sure they've got what they need.
Yeah. So in your 9 years of experience, what's the atmosphere and maybe the communication differences between when you first started with ranchers and how the things have changed now with growing the grasslands and making the habitat? Has that changed much, or is it pretty similar?
No, it actually hasn't. And I think that's what's gained us a ton of support. So if we look at where the Sage Grouse Initiative started in 2010, is that the sage grouse was petitioned to be listed as an endangered species. And it was found to be warranted, but precluded, meaning that it was outranked by other species, right? Other species had a higher priority than it. And so it gave NRCS and partners the ability to actually be proactive instead of reactive, right? Normally when a species is listed, it's listed, and then we work to get it off the list. And in this case, we knew it had the chance to be listed and had a date for when it was going to be reexamined. And so we could get ahead of that and try and get enough conservation on the ground in the right places to prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
And so NRCS sat down with Fish and Wildlife Service and said, here are the practices that we offer that we think will benefit the landscape. Do you agree? Are there stipulations we need to put in place, and how do we do that? And the impetus behind all of this was really conservation through sustainable ranching. And because that message hasn't changed for 10 years, I think that's what gained us so much support from the ranching community, is that we truly believe the best thing on these Western rangelands is providing grazing systems that benefit ranchers. And if we can support that, then that's a win. Because once you shift away from grazing, basically any other use of that landscape is going to be detrimental, not only to sage grouse, but any of the other species that use it. And so being consistent in that, we have really seen the communities who balk at endangered species. When you start looking at, say the spotted owls in the Northwest forest, where it was kind of being done to them, but we're turning to these ranchers saying, hey, we're depending on you. How do we help keep you on the landscape? And that message has really resonated. Yeah.
And so what does sustainable ranching kind of look like?
Yeah. So it's, I'm going to back up for a second and get to that, is that the Sage Grouse Initiative is a part of the Working Lands for Wildlife effort that NRCS has. So there's a bunch of different initiatives under that. And sustainable ranching is part of this idea that it's maintaining working landscapes. And so for a landscape to work, there's some economy based on it, right? beef and cattle production, sheep production, corn, soybeans, right? There's some kind of working capital being produced on that landscape. And so how do we maintain that economy and make it viable long term? And in doing that, provide wildlife habitat for the species that depend on it. So from a ranching standpoint, that looks at having the right infrastructure, so pipelines and troughs and wells to get water where you need to so you can more effectively use the landscape, but also so that you can use cattle as a management tool to make that rangeland actually more healthy long term. And in doing that, you get better, healthier cows, and you also get better, healthier wildlife.
Dang, that was a really good answer. So the Sage Grouse Initiative, you said, started back in 2010.
Yep.
Since the start of the Sage Grouse Initiative, do you have an idea of how many acres of land and ranchers you guys have worked with?
So we just eclipsed 9.1 million acres in the West of impacted acres. And we've worked with over 2,500 different producers in that landscape. To kind of put this in additional context, because that just captures kind of the West. If you look at working lands for wildlife westwide, which picks up parts of the Great Plains down to Oklahoma and Texas and works with lesser prairie chickens, we're at almost 11 million acres impacted since 2010. And we've worked with over 3,600 producers in that landscape.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of land.
Yeah.
Is that land, would that all be considered private land for hunting purposes, or is any of those acreages or acres considered public hunting land, or is it off limits?
So the unique thing, right, when you get out west is it's a lot of these landscapes are dominated by BLM ground, a little bit of Forest Service here and there. But it's the high quality land. If you think about people, moving west and where they settled, the really critical pieces are the wet meadow mesic areas along streams and rivers. And most of those, 80% of those resources lie on private ground. But the operations as a whole depend on being able to access the public ground that surrounds it. So a lot of these projects are actually really close partnerships where the private landowner has the cows and the allotment and is working with BLM. And so you're impacting both private and public ground, and that's ground that benefits any of us that we can go out and use.
Yeah, no, that makes it even better that it benefits us and benefits them as well. So we're always looking for. So Pheasant Fest was a few weeks back, and when I was there, I was talking to there's a group called the Sage Grouse Society, and just some other people, or not Sage Grouse. It might have been a Rough Grouse Society, I think is who it was I was talking to. But anyways, I was talking to him and mentioned that I'm going to be heading out to Wyoming to sage grouse hunt this year, and just looking forward to it. And everybody that not everybody, but a majority of the people that I talked to at Pheasant Fest said, it's a good thing you're going this year because we don't know how much longer the sage grouse are going to be around. And it's after hearing your how many acres of land, you guys said that you've helped with and whatnot. It's crazy to me to think that, people are thinking in this manner of the sage grouse is going away when it's, and so can you
so it's a really dynamic one because partly, right, sage grouse used to inhabit 11 Western states. So, right, basically from the edge of North and South Dakota all the way out to California, from Arizona all the way up into a couple of Canadian provinces. And so when you think sage grouse range, you want to stand on the hilltop and turn and not be able to see any other thing as far as you can see, right? They like huge intact landscapes. And it's just anything you do to start breaking that landscape up starts pushing them out. And they're interesting in that, power line going through an area which you wouldn't think has a big impact, actually they'll stop using 500 meters on either side of that power line. They might cross under it, but they won't use that habitat. They'll stay away from it. And our best guess on why that is they see those perch points for raptors that can see them, right? Because they're a big bird. And so as we've fragmented the habitat and made it smaller, we've condensed sage grouse into certain pockets. And so you do get this really large population decline when you're looking at this massive range of, but numbers keep going down because we keep kind of chipping away at these large intact landscapes. That being said, if you look at the areas that continue to be large and functioning landscapes, big core areas that are unimpacted at the moment, sage grouse numbers have actually been increasing in those spots. Nice. And so you kind of have this gradient, right? Where you have the good habitat, numbers are good and going up. Where you have that kind of transitioning where it's still mostly intact, but maybe something's coming in, development. One of the big things we fight is conifer encroachment. So pinyon pines and cedars are encroaching into areas where it's not. Large scale fires are shifting to annual invasive grasses. Where those are starting to come in, populations are stable, right? They're kind of holding on. They're not going up or down. But as soon as you get outside of that, where the habitat's fragmented, populations are going down. And I think because there's more area that has been fragmented and is being impacted, that's why you get this overall trend line of sage grouse populations are going down. And I think more than anything, we know the tools to implement. It's the pace and scale at which we can implement them is our biggest limiting factor. It's having the bodies on the ground to implement the practices. It's having the funding in the right spots. There's a whole ton of things that go into that. But for an example, right, a really cool project that came out, it's kind of, would be the gold standard of anything, is in Oregon, they've been removing conifers from the landscapes where they shouldn't be. And in those landscapes, they've seen sage grouse populations increase 12%.
Oh, wow. How long have they been doing that project for?
Yeah, that was a 10-year study. So, it's a long-term study. And the thing is, as soon as you cut the trees down, the birds will come right back in. They've got radio collared data that it's not like it takes 2 or 3 years for the birds to come back. Once the trees are out, they come right back in and they'll start using that area much more effectively. They have higher brood survival rates, higher nesting rates in those areas that have been treated.
So you guys have radio collars on sage grouse?
Yeah. So there's the other really thing that I think is important that Sage Grouse Initiative does extremely well, and Working Lands for Wildlife as a whole, is not just acres impacted, right? We would consider those to be outputs, how many acres, how many feet, you name it. What we look at is outcomes. So what does this mean to sage grouse? What does this mean to the landscape? What does this mean to producers, right? There's all of that is kind of encompassed. And so we have a science coordinator who works with other groups, USGS, other universities, to keep track of what are the impacts from these projects. And so that was a long-term study in Southern Oregon where they radio collared sage grouse and had areas that were treated and controls where they weren't treated, and they were able to see how sage grouse used those landscapes differently.
Oh man, that'd be some pretty cool data to see how they travel. And do they like a pheasant, they kind of say like, oh, a mile range is kind of what a pheasant lives in. Do you know, based on that study, how far grouse will travel in a given year, time of year? Or is it just
the funny thing is it depends. There's some grouse kind of not subspecies, but grouse groups that don't travel very far. They'll stay within a given area. And granted, you're probably talking on square miles.
Yeah.
But there are some of up in Montana, the sage grouse that they've GPS backpacked to watch will actually migrate all the way up into Canada and then back down south of the Missouri Breaks. It's like a 250-mile round trip that they're doing every year. And actually, interestingly, mirrors very similar to the pronghorn migration that does a similar tract within that landscape.
I was gonna say we're gonna have to be buying migratory bird feast for these guys as far as they're traveling. Holy smokes, that's a long ways.
Yep.
And so do they? When is, I guess, kind of the migration for?
So it's seasonally based in that Sage grouse are an interesting bird because they don't have a muscular gizzard. They're the only known bird in the U.S. that doesn't have a muscular gizzard. So they're not picking up grain and sand like your pheasants, right, and grinding it up their seeds. So they're really not eating seeds. They're looking at soft-bodied plant material and bugs. And so in the winter, they actually eat 100% sagebrush leaves. And they're one of the few animals that puts on weight eating nothing but sagebrush leaves. And then as you shift into spring, they start shifting over to forbs, so your flowering plants, dandelions, legumes, different things, buckwheat that they'll eat. And they're transitioning through really following the green line at that point. So they breed on big leks, or not, depending on where you're at, they're big leks, but all the males come together and display. And if you haven't seen it, it's amazing. They all get together and fight, right? And there's this sound kind of like popping a champagne bottle, and it's just this really cool sound. If you have the opportunity, you got to get up early to see it. And the females all watch, and right, there's jostling for position, and then they're following the green line down into those green areas I was telling you about that are super important. You can see it on my screen. I know others can't see it. That green line is really important, so they're going to follow that down and be in these really wet meadow, mesic bottoms, really wet areas into the summer. And then as those dry out, that's when they start shifting for their migration. And it just depends on, if they can find it or what's nearby, of really, I think, what drives how far that migration is. There's some groups that kind of have 3 distinct migration points to hit those 3 pieces I talked about. There's others that'll just have 2, kind of a winter and a summer range. And then there's, the Montana group that just has a massive long one.
So do they, when they're traveling, are they looking for wet areas to travel to as theirs kind of dries up a little?
Yeah, in the summer, that's what they're keying in on wet spots. Yeah. And in the winter, they're looking for areas where the sagebrush is above snow level, right? They've got to have access to it. And so they're looking for healthy sagebrush, large intact sagebrush spots where they can hunker down and get some good forage.
Has the droughts that we've been having the past 2 years, I guess, I don't know if Wyoming or Washington areas, if it's been as dry as like the Dakotas and Iowa per se, but have you guys noticed?
Yeah, so what you see with droughts, droughts are cyclical, right? They've come, and the West is in a massive drought right now, is that the most stable kind of populations and lekking grounds where birds come together are where the most stable water supplies are. So if you can count on water year in and year out in a spot, you're probably going to find sage grouse in those areas. In areas where drought has a greater impact, right? So that fluctuation or variability of the water resources is greater. You'll see birds pop up in those spots, but then they'll disappear because they're really looking for a close proximity to get to those. And it's a concern for everybody in the West, that how do you kind of build in that resiliency into these landscapes, given that, we're working in landscapes where average rainfall is 6 to 9 inches for the year, and it's coming as snow. And so,
oh wow, that's not much at all.
No, you're not getting much at all. And we can touch about, there's this really cool thing that we've been doing recently and promoting, working with landowners, which is we call low-tech process-based restoration. So it's not your standard kind of bringing your Tonka toys and trucks and do it. It's trying to figure out how do you give nature kind of the tools to let the system function by itself. And you can do that with grazing systems. We've been doing that with beaver dam analogs and reestablishing beavers in systems where they historically would have been, these things called Z-dike structures. Basically, what it all is slowing the water down. So we've been really good at, right, if something floods, we put a ditch in it and gets water off as quick as we can. And we're trying to slow the water down, which pushes it into the soil and acts as kind of a savings account long term. And where we've seen those projects go in over the last 5 and 10 years, you actually decouple systems from annual precipitation, which means even in a system where you only get 6 to 9 inches of rain, once the system's functioning, it stays wet regardless of how much rain you get. And so there's some really cool projects in the West that we can highlight, and we can see the before and after that. Kind of one of our crown jewels is in Elko, Nevada, right? So super dry system, super dry the last couple of years, and they've got a system in spots that's 100 yards across and 12 feet deep and hasn't gone dry once.
That's crazy. Do they, so in these areas, sorry, my dogs are running around upstairs.
No worries.
I don't know if you can hear them or not, but in these areas that you talked about relocating the beavers and building the dams and stuff, is trapping not allowed at all in those areas?
So there's still, I mean, it's, it's a perception, I think, that it depends on the landowners and the community getting behind it, that beavers are still seen as a nuisance. And so it's figuring out how to work with beavers as a tool to help landowners. And I think we've spent a lot of time educating and promoting that, which is key, right? That it's not going to change overnight, but when you see your neighbor doesn't have to truck water to his cattle and you're trucking water, you're kind of going, wait, what's he doing? And then, that example is interesting because what they shifted was their grazing system, and they didn't promote beavers came in on their own once the system had enough kind of vegetation. But that kind of word of mouth and communities going, oh, I see what's possible if we do this is really interesting. And there's just a ton of little stories across the West from that happening where ranchers are figuring it out on their own. But it'll take, more conversations so that people don't trap and get rid of beaver. Although what we can do, right, is in areas where they're a nuisance, if they're in a town, is trap a beaver and then move it to a location and let them take on the restoration efforts for us, right, if we've given them kind of what they need. And then we get to sit back and they work 24/7 for, nothing but wood scraps.
Yeah, they're happy with just that. They don't have money growing on trees, which is...
Yeah.
I want to go back just a little bit. I was going to ask it and got onto the conversation with the whole radio recording of the radio following the sage grouse.
Yeah.
Were you a part of putting those radio collars on the
Not
birds?
that steady, but I have. Yeah. And it's actually...
How do you do that?
Yeah. This is if you happen to find a group of biologists capturing sage grouse, you would think they were probably high on something and going crazy, because you go out so birds start lekking March, April timeframe, depending on snow and kind of weather conditions. And what you do is you go out in the middle of the night with big fishing nets and someone blaring some rock music on a massive speaker and spotlight, and you walk through the sagebrush looking for the eye glow, right, of them sitting in the sagebrush. And then you just flash them with the light and it kind of freezes them, and you got to get close enough and kind of stay with one person behind with the net till you get close enough, and you bring the net down over them and then grab this thing. So you've got all these people walking around blaring rock music out in the sagebrush, strobe lighting lights across as they run around and dive on sage grouse.
Do you remember what song you had on?
I don't. I think we were playing some AC/DC at the night I was
Back
out.
in Black or something.
Yeah. And they are big, strong birds. I mean, right, they're bigger than a chicken, or in that same chicken size, and they are powerful. So they are, when you get your hands on them, there's no lightly holding it. You it's got to bear hug that thing.
That's crazy. And then is it just a snap collar that you put on them, or?
No, so they're like backpacks. It's a small solar panel, and on the back, so you get longer life, and then you go around the wings and hold it on close to their back, and they'll take 4 points a day, at least the ones we were using, so you can get pretty good movements on them throughout a year, and they last, I think, 18 months before the battery runs out.
Oh, nice. That's pretty awesome. Is there a way to recover them, or you just kind of...
You can't. So, I mean, typically there's a couple mortalities. So if a radio packback stops moving, it'll give you a mortality signal. So it starts pinging at you like, I haven't moved in a while. And you can recover those and get them refurbished and sent back out. If they're on the bird the whole time, it's just cotton straps. So they end up falling off, and you might get a mortality or a non-mortality indication, right? You just find the backpack and can refurbish them. But not always. Sometimes they've probably just lost in the sagebrush.
That's pretty awesome. That kind of reminds me of a story. So we did a prank in high school where we released pigeons in the school. Senior prank.
Yeah.
Not proud of it. But I worked on a farm through high school, and so to catch the pigeons, which anybody that's looking for training pigeons, this could be an option. But we all we did is went to an old barn, took a big old spotlight, and you'd shine it on the pigeon, and it would just freeze them like they had no idea what was going on, and then you just reach up and grab them and throw
Yeah.
them in a bag quick. So that kind of reminded me of that. We weren't playing rock music, but um, that's pretty awesome how you guys did that. How many do you usually do when you're putting those collars on?
Every study is different, and it's probably funding based more than anything. I think when we did it, the price per backpack was, this could be completely wrong. I want to say it was like $5,000 per backpack. They're not cheap. So, I mean, you can radio collar them, and then you're using a radio antenna, and someone has to go out there and get points all the time. And so it's, usually based on what the study needs more than anything, and then what you can afford in terms of backpack. I think we had 16 marked here in Washington State. I couldn't tell you how many they had marked or which way they were marking them down in Oregon off the top of my head.
Yeah. Do you know about how long a sage grouse lifespan is?
Yeah, so sage grouse are actually interesting compared to like quail or pheasant, right? And I'm gonna hit you with some biology facts in that. If you think of quail and pheasants, you gotta think of a mouse, right? They produce a ton of offspring, but they don't live very long. Like a pheasant's a year and a half, 2.5 years is an old pheasant, right? Whereas sage grouse are much more like an elephant, which we call K-type selected, that if you can get them to adulthood, their survivorship at that point is like 80-90% of birds survive. But it's hard to get them to be an adult. And so that's really, that's one of the big pinch points and why we focus on these wet areas is you've got to have the nesting habitat and the mesic resources or the wet resources to get those young all the way up to being an adult. But once they're an adult, they're pretty much set and they can live, 5, 7, 10 years.
Holy smokes. Is like a year old considered an adult or?
Yeah, once they make it to that first, if they can make it through that first winter, they're set. So by the time they hit a year, they're going to be on the landscape for a while.
What is the main sources of mortality for the sage grouse in that first year?
Yeah, it depends on the landscape. Predators, so they're in spots where raven populations are high. They can do a big number on taking out sage grouse chicks. Raptors, especially in the spring on lecking grounds, can take them out. I'm trying to think. Weird one popped in my head. I know they've had problems with it. Ground squirrels will eat some of the eggs. So, it's your standard egg predation folks that are you're getting in the way, and then your larger raptors and birds that are attacking the chicks.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Man, I didn't realize that a sage grouse could live to be 5 to 7 years old. I can't imagine how big they are when they.
Yeah, the big males are. If you get out when you're out hunting, if you get one, they're not small creatures.
Yeah, that's crazy. Before you're talking about how the sage grouse don't have gizzards and they live off of forbs and sagebrush and whatnot. How do they taste?
I would say it's one of those weird things, depending on who you ask. Some people say, the best thing you do is shoot them and you get out a nice applewood board and you smoke them and then you eat the board and throw the sage grouse away. Jeez. I think it just depends, right? If you get an old male, I've heard they taste really sagey, right? Because that's what they've been eating a ton of. And so you're looking for a younger one to eat. But I've also heard folks who they hunt them every year and they get all kinds and they love them. So I think it's probably more how you prep them and your own personal palate than anything.
Do you have a preference on?
I actually haven't. So Washington State is one of three, mostly one of 3 states that doesn't hunt them because our numbers are so low here and they're separated from the rest of the range. So I haven't had a chance to hunt sage grouse yet. The other 2 states are North Dakota and South Dakota. South Dakota has kind of been bouncing around having enough to hunt. But yeah, if I haven't had a chance to kind of venture out and taste one.
Yeah, that'd be kind of interesting. It's kind of like an old deer, an old elk. They say the
Yeah,
bull elks aren't really that good to eat, but you get a young one and it's usually pretty decent.
yeah, I've heard the same thing.
So what a so your background's you're a biologist, right?
Yeah.
Um, what got you interested in working with Pheasants Forever and becoming part of the Sage Grouse Initiative?
Yeah, I actually came a weird route, which when I started as a sage grouse biologist, I'm not sure I could have told you what a sage grouse looks like, right?
Hey,
Which is
all gotta
pretty
learn
interesting.
sometime.
So I grew up down in California, and what got me into it was kind of two things. One, waterfowl hunting. That's what got me into hunting, and I just absolutely loved it. And then high school project working on that our biology teacher said, just find something cool. And in that, kind of fell in love with looking at wetlands and birds, and didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but that's where I started. And so I actually did an undergraduate and a graduate degree really looking at wetland management in the Sacramento Valley and talking with private landowners, because most of the ground there is private, and how they're managing their duck clubs in most cases. Because 2/3 of the wetlands in California are privately owned. And there's this huge variation in how much duck food you can grow. And so we're trying to have a better sense of what that looked like on the landscape. And so after school, that's what I was hoping to get into, and was looking and just couldn't find a wetland specific job. And I went, you know what, I'll broaden my concept of the landscape and see if I can pull in some uplands. And I knew of Pheasants Forever and just started looking for what jobs they had open. I was trying to stay somewhere in the West and stumbled into sage grouse up in Washington State. And then the rest is kind of history from there. But it's been a really fun journey to learn a whole new system. For me, it was a blast because it was like getting paid to go to school, right? You got to go learn this whole new system and this whole new species, but you didn't have the homework and tests to go along with it, and
Yeah,
someone was paying you to do it.
cannot beat that. That is
Yeah.
awesome. What kind of gets you excited about Sage Grouse that you stuck with it for what
So I think it's,
been
to me, it's less about sage grouse. And I mean, I fell in love with this from my time working with private landowners in California. It's the people. It's thinking and finding new and creative ways to support people and being sustainable on the landscape, whatever that is. I would sit down with ranchers here in Washington, and they'd go through, and this is a farm that's been in their family for generations, and they're telling me, oh, granddad, crashed his truck over here, and he's trying, he just loves this landscape, and he's pointing out, we could really use a well over here, and if we could get a couple troughs, that would really let us graze better. And then he'd turn to me like, what? All right, what do I have to do for sage grouse? And I'd go, nothing. And he'd look at me and go, what do you mean nothing? I was like, well, do you see sage grouse? Oh yeah, all the time. I was like, good, then I need to keep you on the landscape, right?
yeah.
And so that idea of, right, how do we keep these communities and these families working the land and make it so they've got some more, disposable income? Because they've got the same worries we do. How do we put food on the table? How do I send my kid to school? How do I pay the bills? How do I retire? Not that farmers ever really retire.
Yeah.
And so if we can find ways to support them, that's what gets me jazzed, because then everything else comes from that, right? These world-class habitat and the sage grouse numbers we have come from those communities that have been born and bred there and are taking care of those landscapes.
Yeah. No, it's funny. My grandpa's 85. He's still out on the farm every single day doing chores. It's like, man,
Yeah,
they just got a work ethic that never ends.
yeah.
Um, are the programs for the ranchers, are they similar? So in Iowa, we have what's called like IHAP land,
Mm-hmm.
where they can enroll into a program which would allow hunters to hunt on it during the year. But we also have like a 10-year program where they can basically plant switchgrass for X period of time, and then they get paid per acre of land. Is that similar to how the programs work?
Yeah, so I mean, Sage Grouse Initiative runs off of, when you hear the Farm Bill, right? All the
Yep.
talk, and CRP, which is under NRCS. It's its own program. There's funding under what we call an Environmental Quality Incentive Program, or EQIP. And so what's unique about NRCS is it's a non-regulatory agency, right? It doesn't dive into any regulatory, and it's all voluntary conservation done by landowners who want helping their land, right? NRCS's motto is helping people help the land. And so while there are some kind of systems like that are rental payments, when you start talking grazing and infrastructure, it's cost share to help them install a fence, and you kind of shoot for, kind of 75% of the cost that NRCS is covering. It doesn't work perfectly, but it's kind of a good ballpark that helps them put in that new fence, or helps them drill a well and put in a pipeline. And if they're trying to learn a new grazing system, right, a new rotational grazing system after you've installed those, providing some funding, because the first rule in cattle grazing is the cows have to go somewhere. So if you've got to go lease some new ground, you might kind of get a rental payment to not graze your ground for a year or two, to let that vegetation come back and flourish and kind of get its foothold back. We can help cost share that put new grasses or more diverse species of grasses and get the flowering plants back on the landscape. So, I mean, the options are endless. I think that's where some of the fun comes in for it. It's thinking through which suite of practices best benefit the landowner and the species you're looking at. So if it's sage grouse or mule deer or, elk, you name it. That's what you're trying to pull together in those.
Nice. No, that's awesome. So we haven't really talked much about you, and this is a ton of great information about sage grouse and what the Sage Grouse Initiative is. And I love this stuff. So you started hunting, you got into it with waterfowl.
Yeah.
Have you got into upland hunting since working with Pheasants forever?
Well, I'd always liked, I did quail hunting and some pheasant hunting in California. I liked it. And actually, the first thing I hunted was wild boar in California. Right after I got my license, we had some access. Wild boar is fantastic. And I've actually gotten more into upland hunting here because it's a lot closer to hunt from my house where I'm at. I found a pretty good spot, although it burnt this year. So I was lamenting that. It was like 20 minutes from my house, and I could go chase chukar and hunt. And I found a nice little sweet spot that was, the year before it burnt, I did not see at least one covey. I went out there, and like I said, it was like, oh, I got an hour and a half. I can run up before I have to pick up the kids and
nice.
Scare up a couple. So I think I've gotten more into it because of how close it is. And I absolutely love upland hunting. I just love getting out there and walking. I'm probably one of the crazy ones that when I go out on a long day, I'm hiking, 15, 20 miles chasing quail and chukar and hun and pheasants. And Washington's really interesting in how dynamic it is, depending on where you're at in the state. So I've had a ton of fun exploring it. I think waterfowl is still near and dear to my heart. I just love sitting in the marsh early in the morning, and when you get decoy set, right, and you hit the call and they respond and they come in just cupped up, it's awesome. But I'm not too picky. As long as I'm out in the woods, it's a blast. Yeah. And I think what drives a ton of it these days is dogs. You said you had your dogs running around upstairs, but I've got two labs. I've got an older one she might have done her last year, trying to gauge. She had some problems with her back hits because she just turned 10. And I've got a 1-year-old I'm having her learn the ropes as we go. And so I'm constantly working on training them and trying to get them ready for hunt tests.
So you run hunt tests as well then?
Yeah.
So you ran them with your older one and going to start with your younger one, or just starting with your younger one?
Well, ran my older one a little bit, right? I don't know if you have kids. I've got a 8 and a 6-year-old, so that took up most of the last 8 years, which meant less time for dog training. But they are to the point now where they love helping, so they've been out helping throw marks. And I got a junior title on my 10-year-old just last year, and so I'm really hoping my goal is to get a master title on my youngest dog. But baby steps. I'm trying to get her ready for her junior pass this year.
Nice. When do those? When are the tests this year? Do you know? Or
first one is middle of next month, I think, if I remember correctly, and then there's 2 or 3 in May. So I'm hoping by the end of May I can have her on a junior title. So we've been working on. She's coming along. It's really fun. All the things have been starting to click recently. Partly the snow's off the ground, so we can get out and train. And she's just. I got her out with some wingers and some dead birds the other day. And the first time she saw the dead duck, she's been mostly picking up pheasants. She was like, "Wait, what's this?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." And then she was amped after that.
Yeah, once they realize what those feathers are.
Yeah.
Did you have her out in the blind or in the uplands this year hunting with you? Or?
No, she just wasn't quite ready this year. And then just weird season. Actually, I went on this was my second year of elk hunting in the state. And so that took up a good chunk in November. And then we had a big dump of snow and then it crusted over. And I don't know if you've run into this problem, but whenever I run my dogs on ice crusted snow, it just tears up their pads. And so they were kind of put up after that. My older dog got out on a good opening day hunt with the kids and we got a limit of ducks, and then they got to go on a good I got invited to a released pheasant hunt, and so that was really beneficial for the puppy to have access to slower, dumber pheasants.
Yeah, it is good. It's exposure for them, and they start learning what the bird is and whatnot. What's one of your favorite hunting stories with your dogs, without your dogs, with your kids?
Actually, one of my favorite hunting stories. So I was down in California, and I was out just on some general public land that you can hunt. And I ran into this ex-Marine who was out hunting. He had just gotten back from, I think, Afghanistan, but he had done like 6 tours in Iraq and 7 tours in Afghanistan, and was getting back, and he was trying to get into hunting. And so I stumbled on him because he had knocked down a pheasant and couldn't find it. So I brought my dog over and we were trying to find it and never did, but got to talking. And so California has this lottery system where you get drawn on refuges. And so if you every so often you get a great piece of mail that says, "Hey, I got drawn for this." And so I called him up and I said, "Hey, I got drawn. It's not the best refuge in the state, but it should be at least a handful of birds and it won't be crowded." He's like, "All right, let's go." And so leading up to that weekend, I was watching the weather and everything started shifting and we had this storm moving in. I was like, we might just get like super, super lucky. And there's only 6 blinds on the refuge. And the one I wanted based on the weather is the closest one to the check station. But we also had last pick. So I was like crossing my fingers, right? Let's get this one. And I was hoping everybody was going to take the standard one, which is get as far away from the check station as you can. And they thankfully did. And so we walked like maybe 100 yards from the check station and get set up. And 5 minutes before shooting light, we had, I think it was like 5 wood ducks land in our decoys. And I was like, all right, we might get one shot at this, we'll be set. And while we're waiting for, first light, which now takes an hour, even though it's only 5 minutes, we had another group land behind us in the trees behind us. And we're just like, all right, just like, okay, we got this. And we're trying to calm, right? And the first light comes and we shot them. And I was like, all right, that's good. We got some birds. And I think we each got one out of the group. And then I think the rest of the refuge may have shot like a total of 10 times the rest of the day. And if we had shot straight, we would have limited out on wood ducks in like 30 minutes because they just came barreling into this pond at like 10 yards, feet down. And we were just like, oh, no, what to do? And shooting. And so it was just fun because there's this guy, who's trying to get back into hunting and have this experience. And so when we came out at the end of the day, we had 12 wood ducks, a drake mallard, and a drake widgeon. And I think the next group had like 3 ducks. And they're like, we were wondering what you guys were shooting at.
Yeah, that is awesome, man. That's a heck of a day. It's a good one for him too, getting back into it and just seeing all those birds. And so this past year was my first year waterfowl hunting. So I grew up opposite. All I did was upland growing up, and I grew up around labs, which is I have Goldens now, and you're talking about when they're cupped up. So we did basically field hunts, and a couple of our fields are super close. They're basically the edge of the field is the city limits, and then our field is the country, where you can hunt. And there's ponds, and then, ponds about 300, 400 yards away. And then the river is, a couple miles away. But it's the way this cornfield is, it's almost like the first cornfield you can the birds
Gotcha.
can come to and the first one they see. And I'm the first 4 or 5 hunts we were limited out within like 25 minutes on geese. And granted, you can only shoot 2 in Iowa, and we only had 4 to 7 people with us, so not a ton of birds, but
Yeah.
just there were some birds that were groups of them that were locked up like 400 yards out. They're already just coming in, and I'm just like, oh my God. Oh my
Yeah.
God. And, this is my dog's first year, and we're out there and all these birds are coming. And I'm just like, I'm trying to stay calm to keep them calm. And I'm super excited because everything's working. These birds, when we were picking up, they were landing like 20 yards from the truck.
Yeah.
They wanted that field. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my God. When they say on the eggs, man, we couldn't even be any more on the eggs.
Yeah. I think that's my favorite part of waterfowl hunting is that build of anticipation, right? I love the burst when you get a pheasant to pick up, but when you're seeing the birds coming, like you said, and sometimes they lock up way out there, and it's just that anticipation is just building and building and build. You can't beat it.
That's like, I think what draws me to both of them is it's such a different aspect of the birds, right? Like you said, the upland hunting, you don't know where, you can't see the bird, right? But your dog is on it. And so you got that anticipation of your dog getting birdie and the bird shooting up out of the grass. But then waterfowl hunting, you see them from way over and you might throw them a flag, give them a call, and then you start seeing them turn, or they're out there and they turn back towards you. It's like, oh my God, here we go.
Yeah.
And I think that's just awesome. Just the two different aspects and that's what makes it exciting, because you can do one and then go to the other, and it's just a completely different hunt.
Yeah.
And I just like being able to take my dogs on both of them and get them out and exposed to them.
That's what I found here. I had a couple good days where I got super spoiled, where I'd get out and I'd hunt ducks in the morning, get my limit, and then just turn around basically and walk into the uplands and chase quail and chukar and pheasants.
And that's a day. I wish Iowa had a few more upland species. We are starting to see some more huns and in some areas, but it's pretty limited to, the main uplands pheasant. But I do like chasing quail, man, when they get up out of the ground, just that type of flutter that they have. It's awesome.
You got to come west sometime, because depending on which state, Washington has 7 upland species you can hunt.
Oh, wow.
And you could do all of, if you worked at it, you could probably hunt all of them in one day. So you've got blue grouse, rough grouse, spruce grouse, Hungarian partridge, chukar, quail, and pheasant.
Jeez, you guys got it all. How many have you bagged all the species out there?
No, I've tried. I've gotten blues and roughed. I haven't got a spruce grouse, is the one I've been missing, but it's a smaller population. You got to go up in the northern, kind of northeast piece to chase those, but I've gotten everything else. Yeah. And actually, technically, if they were open, we have sharp-tail and sage grouse. But I think I think Idaho, you could get 9 species, and the same might be true for Montana if you worked it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Might have to move out west. I know a couple guys that live in Montana, and man, they just love it out there. I don't know if I'd like their winters. I think is a little worse than here with as much snow as they get, but
gotcha.
That part would be a little brutal. But well, Michael, thanks for coming on the podcast. Tons of great information about sage grouse. It was awesome learning about you and your dogs and what got you into hunting and a couple of your stories. Again, we'll stay in touch. I appreciate it. I learned a ton about it, and everybody check out Sage Grouse Initiative. Make sure to give them a follow on Instagram, and we'll do what we can to support the sage grouse and the habitat, and hopefully keep them going for many years to come.
That sounds great. Yeah. If you've ever got questions on any of it, you're headed west, don't hesitate to reach out.
Oh, I will.
Good.
Awesome. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
Bye.